Welcome to the Selling Show, where we unpack, repack, and break down exactly how top experts sell their ideas, their value, and their services. This is your host, David Newman, and you are in the right place if you want better clients, bigger deals, and higher fees. There is so much crazy advice out there. We got leadership, we got self-leadership, we got career, we got all kinds of crazy stuff. Luckily, my next guest is going to straighten us out on the real deal of leadership in 2023. Dan Pontefract, welcome to the Selling Show.
Hey, David, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure. Let's get at her.
So tell me a little bit about your backstory and what brought you to the work that you're doing today, and what were some interesting pit stops along the way?
Well, I guess as a kid, I was always interested in other people's well-being. I was always captain of this team, that team, this team, presidents of student councils, and so on. And I got into university thinking I wanted to be a doctor, so that was to help people. But I ended up realizing that I can't even stand the sight of my own blood, so that wasn't a good step. So I switched over to an education degree, a BA B.Ed, and thought I would become a teacher. I did that for 2 years, David, and then basically went into higher education and the teaching of adults through corporate universities and becoming a chief learning officer eventually.
How about that? And go ahead and drop some names, SAP and who else?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to work for some big blue chips. So SAP for about 6 or 7 years. TELUS is another one, kind of like one of Canada's examples of Verizon or AT&T. And just some glorious opportunities to work with many different senior leaders and team members across the world.
How about that? So I'm right here outside Philadelphia. So just fun fact between you and me, none of our listeners care. Were you with SAP in Newtown Square, or were you global?
I've been to Newtown Square many times, right near you. And I was on the global team, so I spent a lot of time in Germany, a lot of time in Palo Alto and other spots of the world. But I was based in Vancouver in that satellite office.
Awesome. Great. Well, tell us about the leadership craziness. I opened up with, there's a million flavors of leadership. It's one of the biggest bookshelves, both virtual and in a bookstore in the business section. One argument would be, the world just doesn't need another leadership book or leadership speaker. You've got a very interesting, very distinct take on leadership. Been there, done that, bought many of the t-shirts. Talk to us about kind of what's right, what's wrong with leadership development in corporate America, and then what is some of your unique perspective and insights into how to do it right.
How long we got, David?
We got 3-4 hours, man. Yeah, we're good.
Well, listeners may not like this, but there's a lot of snake oil out there in leadership development, training, book land. And partially that's because there are people riding off the backs and coattails of giants before us who are just switching words around and saying it's theirs. You have others who have never stepped foot in a leadership role and have not lived the life and the work life of what it's like to lead a team, let alone lead transformational culture change. And anywhere in between, you've got a bunch of posers who believe they have the best next new shiny object of leadership stratagem. And they're not doing the primary global research to prove with evidence that actually what they've got is something that can be used and applied in a sensible, change positive way. So that's the top three. I could go on, but I don't want to belabor this show.
No, that's fantastic. So let's talk about the original research. I would love to know kind of what you found firsthand, research, surveys, obviously talking to your clients and audiences. What is the leadership landscape, and give us some of the highlights of the research that you've done and sort of how that impacts your work?
Yeah, I guess I've always been a wonk, a research wonk in particular, as much as I love being on stage and delivering a keynote or 50 a year. What really drives me is proof, is evidence. And so 3 things have happened for this particular book. A, I'm fortunate to do what are called culture assessments. And so in my line of work, when I'm not a speaker or a facilitator, when I'm an actual consultant and a strategist, I'll be asked to go into organizations of, medium to large size companies and say, hey, can you assess where we're at with our leadership development, our leadership behavior, our culture, our collaboration, our use of technology, our communication, you name it. So I've done 15 of those since the year 2018. And I went back and reviewed the data. So those include one-on-ones, those include focus groups, those include surveys and assessments. And I had this treasure trove of data. So I started feeding that into my brain and saying, well, what can I glean from these 15 big companies? Secondly, to your point, I did go out and interview 221 individual leaders and non-leaders around the world, sort of get their take on, is work-life balance a thing? If it's not, what might be better? And then thirdly, again, I conducted primary global research with just about 10,000 people in 11 countries to assess them and their take on, well, what's this work-life thing? What are the factors? And is your employer and your leader helping you or not? And if not, then what is it that you might want to see differently going forward? So 3 big buckets that had to be fed into this little pea brain of mine and to ultimately come out with an output of some sort.
Wow. Very, very cool. I'm also curious, tell me a little bit about how you navigated the transition from corporate executive, corporate leader into the world of consulting and authorship and speaking. Kind of what were stuff. So, for example, were you either writing books or speaking while you were still on the inside in your corporate role, or did all of that start once you were on your own?
Such a really important question for those that may be thinking about this. When I left SAP to join TELUS back in the ripe age of 2008, right when the fiscal cliff was just about to happen, remember those good days, I consciously made a decision. Although at SAP, I was doing some speaking, I wasn't really doing anything of note, and I certainly wasn't writing. And so when I joined TELUS to be part of really what the CEO wanted to do was a culture change, I said to myself, here's a pretty good opportunity to start publicly writing and maybe speaking more. And that was an effort because, doesn't happen overnight. So I was finding my way into conferences and talks for free, of course, just to sort of get legs wet, feet wet, whole body wet, and see what would happen. And that eventually, David, in one particular conference, there was an editor from Wiley in the audience. And in 2012, that editor approached me and said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I was like, actually, I'm halfway through a book. And I sent over the manuscript to him and he said, hey, you're a pretty good writer, but we already have Pat Lencioni. So we're not looking for a leadership fable. We're looking for your real voice. Could you do that? And I said, sure. So in 2013, my first book came out because of Wiley and because of that interaction, because I pushed myself out into the public domain. And 5 years later, 2 books after that, I decided in 2018 to leave and to carve a path as a company of one and to continue kind of that leadership work inside a company, whether it's a talk or developing stuff, consulting, what have you, but going external and doing it for others.
How about that? And book number 1 was Lead, Care, Win.
Book number 1 was called Flat Army. That was a culture change book, right? Corporate culture change. Then in 2016 came The Purpose Effect, which is a book about the 3 types of purpose, where it's personal, role, and organizational. So I'm still employed by TELUS at this point. My third book, still under the employ of TELUS, was called Open to Think, which is really a question about creative and critical thinking and how you apply that. And that came out in 2018. So 3 books, still fully employed by a great organization whom I still do work with today. And then went on my own January 1st, 2019.
How about that? That's incredible. And then tell me the path of your TEDx career, because you are, doing 1 is challenging enough. You've done 4, is that correct?
Yeah.
Tell us how that started.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm a big believer, David, in the adage, my network is my net worth. And I have always encouraged leaders and team members to cultivate their strong ties, which in turn can turn into weak ties if you tap into that network. And so similarly with the TEDx's that I've been privileged to do, they've all been by virtue of a network. So someone may recommend me to a TEDx organizer and say, hey, I think you should really have Dan for this. He's got a new book coming out, or he's thinking about this. So I've never, it sounds horribly pretentious and un-Canadian of me, David, but I've never approached anyone. They've all approached me, and it's because someone has recommended me. So I'm quite honored and lucky to have a network that would do that for me, in essence.
Are you loving this interview as much as I am? Holy smokes. Hey, you know what this reminds me of? There's a fantastic sales book that you got to get your hands on right here, right now. It's called Do It Selling. How do I know it's great? Well, I wrote it, and you need to read it. Pop over right now to doitselling.com. Now, back to our interview. So let's talk about Work-Life Bloom. Work-Life Bloom is the latest and greatest. Tell us a little bit about how that book came to be. What need did you see in the marketplace? What need did you see in your client base to write this book and speak on it and consult on it?
Yeah, those 3 pockets of research were really screaming at me, from the culture assessments to the one-on-ones and to the global surveying that I was doing. It was also a bike ride, actually, to be honest. I love cycling. And one day it was about March of 2021, I'm noodling this idea and sort of sketching out the book and architecting it. And I've been writing, but not quite clear yet on what the right architecture of the book would be. And I literally saw this wonderful patch of flora of these flowers blooming. And it got to me thinking, that would be an interesting metaphor. And then what's getting in the way of blooming? And I started to reverse engineer. And maybe we're asking the wrong questions inside the organization. So for example, David, is work-life balance a thing? So I started teasing that out. Is employee engagement a thing? And if it's not, then are we asking the wrong question about what it means to be an engaged employee? Is bringing our best selves, our most authentic selves to work a thing? And if it's not, what are leaders doing that's actually getting in the way of that? So I'm culpable, quite frankly, of all 3 of those as a leader. And that bike ride got me thinking about those 3 in particular, and then saying, well, if we reverse engineered that, what is it that people are yearning for? And if you just kind of think about it, David, it's not about engagement or balance or best self. We're like weather. Like there's cycles and there's seasons and there's seasonality and there's storms and there's sun, there's good weather, there's bad weather. So really we adopt personas in the organization, but that same persona really is reflected in our lives. So rather than balancing work and life, might we integrate it? Rather than employee engagement, might we strive to bloom in work and life? And rather than, your most authentic self, can we just be our best in both work and life? And so that's where the work became the work for me in the book, and teasing out kind of a new model.
That is so fascinating. I think specifically because folks that talk about employee engagement and culture and all of these things, a lot of times it's portrayed as a one-way street. So you have some culture shift, maybe it's a merger or an acquisition or some leadership change. The culture changes, people get disengaged, they get maxed out, stressed out, burned out, and they leave. It's a one-way street. And what you're saying is, well, no, this is just a storm. This is just a storm. The weather's going to pass. It's going to be sunny again tomorrow morning, little partly cloudy in the afternoon, probably another storm next week. So it sounds like people need a bigger vision of their career and a little bit more resiliency, because tell me about the path back from burnout, stressed out, maxed out, and kind of how those seasons change. If I'm a leader and I'm noticing, oh gosh, something is wrong, the first answer is probably not, hey, let's fire everyone because they're all maxed out, burned out, and stressed. What's the comeback story? What's the comeback strategy?
Such a great and important question. And that's kind of where I'm going, is that if you imagine work and life on a 2x2 matrix, so let's put work on the y-axis and life on the x. So if on the top right, that's blooming. So that means basically work is going really well and life is going really well. And of course, what I mean by life is not, can you balance a checkbook, or, do you need help in setting up a garage sale on Saturday? It's what are the self-character attributes that help me in both life and work. So up at the top right is blooming. And if we're to argue, David, that there's three other personas. So let's look at the top left for a second. So work is going really well, the work factors, I call them, but my life factors are not going so well. You're budding. So just like a seed turns into a small little plant that's budding, trying to burst out, that's what you are. You're like, oh, this work stuff's pretty good, but the life stuff, like we'll get to that, but it's not really working out for me right now. So I need some help, boss. Can you help me move to bloom because I've dropped the budding or I'm just budding? On the bottom right, so work sucks. Let's just call it what it is. And life is going pretty well with me as my character development. Well, I call that stunted, just like a plant where they need some extra nutrients or sunlight or soil or you name it, whatever the case may be, they need help. And so the leader should be saying, hey, what's getting in the way here at work that I can help you move from stunted to blooming? And then the bottom left, when work and life are not going so hot, that's what I call in need of renewal. And when you're in need of renewal, the leader really should be looking at both the work and the life factor somewhat obviously. So where do I go with this? It's not about being engaged and not engaged or disengaged or chronically disengaged, because again, the leader has to be having a very empathetic, open conversation, because as I say often, we bring our work into our lives, nevertheless, our lives shape us, right? And if that's the case, why aren't leaders having a more wholesome, fulsome, holistic conversation about those kind of work and life scenarios? Because to your credit, you never know when that acquisition is going to come. You never know when maybe your spouse is transitioned to another city and you have to set up shop in another city. So your network and your relationships are limited. You don't feel like you belong anymore. You're not respected because you've moved into a neighborhood where it's just different politics, let's say. And all these things can affect you and weigh on you in both work and life. So as a leader, I argue that this is like a humanity model. How are we having these better conversations and dialogue about work and life?
Very, very powerful. So when someone is stuck, so life is great, work sucks. Is this a coaching conversation? Is this, hey, would you be happier working over here in this department? So Dan, we don't want to lose you because you're a great guy. You're super smart. You're hardworking. Sounds like you're not in the right seat, to quote the Jim Collins bus.
Nice,
you're not in the right seat, dude. Like, this is no longer fun for you. You've outgrown this role. You've outgrown this department. Let's move you from department A to department B. Let's get your career development plan. Let's get your learning and development pathway to reconnecting with the joy and the purpose in a role that we can really benefit from. How does a leader have some of those difficult conversations when they see someone who used to be doing a great job and they've just fallen off the radar? Their life is great, but they're not happy. They're maybe getting sloppy. They're letting some things slip. And it's a good person. It's a good employee. But you as the leader realize there's something wrong here. There's something that's no longer connecting. How do we get those employees reconnected?
Fantastic question. And again, I believe that in my research, it comes down to 6, what I call work factors. So the 6 are trust, belonging, feeling valued, a sense of purpose, the strategy of the organization, and lastly, what I call norms. So any of those factors really need to be in discussion with said employee. So trust. Did something happen where that employee now is falling off that cliff because they don't feel trusted by the team, the boss? Maybe another group is reprimanding this individual for some reason. So now all of a sudden they're like, I'm not trusted. I used to be. What happened? Or again, maybe some of the composition of the team, increase, decrease, what have you, and that sense of belonging. There's less positive experiences going on that team for that team member. And therefore they don't feel represented. They don't feel safe anymore. Something's happened. Something again is getting in the way. And another one, like purpose. So if this individual has for some reason come into, I guess, contact and connection with their sense of meaning, and that has changed because the company now or never really acted with a sense of purpose. And so from a life work or a life perspective, David, they now have this different, upgraded, if you will, evolved sense of meaning in life. And the role that they're playing is not purpose driven at the organization, hence the work factor. That can be like nails on a chalkboard or, eating a bucket of aluminum foil.
Yeah.
So if we're not having those conversations about some of those factors and wondering and asking and querying and, empathetically having discourse about what's up, then we're heads in the sand leaders. And sure, some people need to move on. I get it. I'm not naive. I've done my own fair share of those as well. But the organization should be having these holistic conversations because talent is tough out there and it's a war of attrition. And if we're not acting on behalf of the organization and saying, oh my gosh, David, you'd be so suited over here on the sales team. I know you've been in marketing for a while, but gosh, you have some great, I trust you. I think your sense of belonging will be better over there in sales. Can we maybe have that conversation? But if we're not, and we're hoarding, or we just don't care, and we're abject about the whole thing, that's when the renewal or the stunted personas start popping up.
Yes. Well, I think another thing that is really distinct, Dan, about your work, and especially the way that you lay out your system in Work-Life Bloom, is there are life factors. And a lot of managers and a lot of leaders is like, hey, leave the life problems at the door. We're professionals. So because we're professionals, we don't let death, divorce, my dog is sick, I'm trying to adopt a kid and the paperwork is held up. It's like, oh, by the way, you're the VP of research and development. We don't care about the wife, the dog, the adoption, etc. That is really very short-sighted and very dangerous. Walk us through the life factors so we can take an inventory there as well.
Well, if our lives shape our work, nevertheless, our work shapes us, then there's got to be a balance. And I know I'm using that word because I'm against work-life balance, but there's got to be a balance of the work and the life factors to integrate them. So you have to have 6 work factors coming up against 6 life factors. And the 6 life factors, again, are about character. So number 1, relationships. Do I have a community of strong and weak ties, if you will, that allow me to feel connected? Dr. Vivek Murthy, who's the Surgeon General in the US, on the end of May issued an 88-page report, just incidentally, and said that loneliness is the new epidemic in our organizations. So relationships are so key. And if a leader is not having a conversation about those connections, both at work and outside of work, then we're just exacerbating the loneliness piece that Vivek Murthy has pointed out, which is, of course, then going to affect performance. So relationships, number 1. Skills. Are we having conversations about the development of the self, the aptitudes gained in order to perform, both in work and in life, hence it being a life factor? Well-being. So are people emotionally, socially, physically, financially healthy? And are you having conversations about that? Whether that's pay, whether that's literally your physical health, whether that's having conversations about, some of the programs your company might have that can help people with respect to the benefits that come with counseling or therapy or, physio, what have you, right? And the last 3, meaning, agency, and respect. Meaning is that self-worth. Agency is having the self-determination to make decisions. And of course, respect is feeling dignity, feeling admired basically for who you really are. And so those 6 are not, can you balance a paycheck or a balance your own bank account? It's not about naming your new puppy Fido. It's not those types of chicken soup for the soul things. It's actually having human conversations about the things that can help you in life, but then are brought into the work itself.
That's terrific. Let me ask you, what are the various investable opportunities in your world? So what are the various ways, online, offline, in person, that you will help your clients to install this leadership operating system into their companies? And what are all the different sort of levels and distribution methods for your expertise?
Well, first and foremost, I'm going to have to attribute you going forward. I love the idea of LOS, the leadership operating system.
That is my gift to you, my friend. You picked that right up.
Not clever enough to have thought of that one. That's really good. So I'm a walking pie graph. And so my pie graph, as I try to articulate to people, comes in essentially 5 flavors. I do about 30 to 50 keynotes a year. And that might be for a company, that might be for a public conference, right? Some of them are free, some of them are paid. I facilitate workshops. Those workshops might be half day or full day. And the workshops are following a path of what's the topic you want to get into? Purpose, being less distracted, How do we collaborate better as a team or a unit or an organization, what have you? The third of the 5 is what I call book writing, which makes almost no money. But any of the writing I do for HBR, Forbes, et cetera, that plugs me into thinking. And whether it's a book or an article or column, that's also a way in which for me to provide some thought leadership, if you will. Number 4 are those aforementioned assessments. So I will go in and assess organizations' culture, their leadership, whatever the case may be, and provide an audit. And then number 5 is essentially what you've pointed out. It's the consultative bit. So that's taking the leadership operating system of like Work-Life Bloom or Lead Care Win or the Purpose Effect and saying, hey, what do we need to tease out here so that we help you and your leaders transform that culture? So that's the activation mode of going from point A to point Z with the steps in between in order to get there.
Most of your clients, US, Canada, Europe, where are the hotspot concentrations of where mostly you're invited to speak and consult?
Yeah, really. Another good question, given I just renewed my E1 visa from into the US, which means that you have that sort of sports athlete celebrity visa and you can come in and out of the country quite easily. I guess my time versus revenue percentage is a little bit different, but we just looked at it on a general basis. It's about a 60-30-10 split. So 60% Canada, 30% US, and 10% international.
Very cool. Are you looking to move those at all, or are we kind of happy with that mix?
It's a really good question. And I definitely would love to sort of increase the US based side. I find there's so much to learn, but also to do in the US. And there's such a willingness for people to think differently. And certainly size matters. When Canada is 40 million and the US is almost 400 million, there's a lot of opportunity in the US as well for a guy like me. And quite frankly, they're just some of the friendliest people on earth. And I'm not saying that to blow smoke. It's that there's just this wide, bite-eyed tail look on their faces like, yeah, we do want to do this. Where sometimes there's a bit of timidity in Canada and it sort of takes some cajoling to say, well, you should do this.
Right, right. Now, I know you also have a fantastic podcast. Talk to us about your adventures in podcasting. I'm going to have a little bit of fun with this because if people want to check out the podcast, which they should, you've done an episode with Mitch Joel, and there's also video there. I'm wondering, when the two of you are talking, who can tell who's who? It's two handsome bald guys. What's going on? Dan, Mitch, Dan, Mitch. You don't know who's who.
Two semi-handsome bald Canadians with the Canadian accent as well. Yes.
Yes, indeed. So talk about the podcast and sort of how that came to bloom, if you will.
Yeah, well done. Touche. The show is called Leadership Now. And I've always been fascinated, first and foremost, by how a lot of these posers we were talking about before speak to the future of work. And I have said repeatedly that the future of work is now. We need to stop thinking about how far out things could be because there are a lot of crisis points that we need to fix and mitigate now. With that all being said, Leadership Now is about what can we do now and have a conversation specifically about the now of leadership. And I tend to, again, believe back into my adage, my network is my net worth. That's a question for me to then say, oh, who do I know and who do I not know that someone can help me know so that I could ask them onto the show? And I'm quite lucky. I mean, I've had guests from Arianna Huffington to Alan Mulally to Daniel Pink to Roger Martin to Linda Grattan to Mitch Joel. You know, just quite lucky to have an arsenal of people that I can touch and ask questions about what makes leadership to you in the now.
Holy smokes, so much value in this episode. Listen, if you are loving what you're hearing, feel free to download, subscribe, tell a friend, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to The Selling Show. Now, back to the interview. Let's talk about now, because we're in a very interesting moment. And again, depending on the industry that you're in, recession, depression, inflation, the tech sector is wobbly. Banking had a meltdown a couple of months ago. This is the living organism, right? This is the seasons that you're talking about. So there's huge thunderstorms in financial services. Kind of a pretty bad storm, not necessarily big thunder, but a lot of tech is freaking out. layoffs and what's going on with Twitter. And now we have Threads and, is the tech sector going to be imploding, et cetera. When you're talking to leaders that are at these inflection points of crisis or fear, or, what's happening in the next 6 months? Will I even have a job? Will they sell our division? Will they shut down our division? They're genuine moments of crisis or turmoil. I'm imagining that what you teach is even more important and more critical with work-life bloom and having that infrastructure in place to weather the storm. How do you convince them when they're freaking out and their hair's on fire?
Well, there's two parts to that, actually, right? There's I hope that they're not freaking out because I've got to them well before. Even though I talk about the future of work is now, the word future is still in there. So you have to be able to create that synergy or balance or integration between thinking about that future, but preparing for it in the now. And that's where so often it goes wrong. And so you can sort of part two is scold said leader a little bit or a bunch of leaders and say, well, why didn't you do this? Now, okay, we're in a crisis right now. We have to do two things. We have to sort the crisis out now because you got yourself into this place because you weren't proactive and now you're reactive. But simultaneously, we need to think about the next crisis in the now. So what are the changes we're going to make, the architecture changes from your, what I call dream, decide, do, repeat mantra? So how are we going to be more reflective and not just reactive? How are we going to take time to dream and to marinate so we can predict better? Can't always predict 100%, as you know, but predict better some of those seasonality changes that are no doubt going to come. So let me give you a practical example. If you're just as an individual and you say, oh, I've got 40 hours of work, great. I'm going to plug 40 hours of meetings and work into my calendar. What you're not basically doing is you're not creating this situation where there might be the need for 8 hours. So what are you doing to add or block off, I should say, David, like 2 hours or an hour a day, something to give you time and buffer? So that kind of analogy is like, well, if I use 40 hours a week and then I need 8 more hours, I'm going to work 48 hours a week. Well, that's a burnout stress issue waiting to happen. The same thing can be applied when it comes to culture and organizational dynamics and like work-life bloom. If you're not preparing for in the now, the future, and saying to yourself, well, what is it that we need to be ready for? Acquisition, a tornado, some sort of environmental issue, a fiscal cliff. Like there's always something that's going to pop up. Depression, inflation, interest rates. So if you're not doing that collective, collaborative, stratagem kind of thinking up front, you're going to end up in these crises where you're playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah, reactive versus proactive. And taking the time, I think it's the subtitle of one of your books, actually, right? Slow down so that you can process this, prepare for this. It's like the US Navy SEALs. One of their mantras is slow is fast, right? Slow is fast, and like fast is smart. So they literally slow down their breathing. They process more information when they're in a high crisis situation. Most of regular untrained people, not Navy SEALs, their breath gets sharp and shallow and they start to panic and they start to freak out and they're not seeing what's in front of them. And that's where you make bad decisions and that's how you get killed.
Well, I mean, very classic example of bringing up Navy SEALs, right? It was the assassination of bin Laden. So slow down, think creatively, and make better decisions is the full subtitle to that book. So what are they doing? Like for months, they're preparing, they're thinking about different scenarios. What could happen? The what ifs were, 10 pages long. And a what if happened. A what if happened with a Black Hawk Down scenario, effectively, right? Did they panic? No, because they had planned for what I would call a pre-mortem. So this wasn't looking at things post-mortem and saying, oh my God, why did this all happen? It was planning for the pre-mortem and going in effectively having gone through pressure testing different scenarios. And so back to the original question, which I love, by the way, and that is, what can leaders do? Well, they have to be far more proactive and do the pre-mortem in advance and thinking through, well, what might happen, not to the point where it's debilitating and you aren't doing actual course of business in the now, but you've got to carve out time to do some of that pre-planning because you just never know. And it's good business to be prepared for a potential crisis.
Yes. Amen times 10. I'm going to ask you what sounds like a silly question because we've been talking about it the whole time. But the quote unquote silly question is, how do you generate leads? And the reason I say it's silly, you've got the 4 TED Talks. Those are lead generators. You have these incredible books. You have the podcast. You have all of this amazing platform. I'm imagining that you are still proactively reaching out to associations or conferences or companies that you would like to do work with. What does prospecting look like in your world, Dan?
It's a great question. 3 things basically are happening. So there is the word of mouth that happens. So, Scott Stratton, a really good friend and business thinker, author, and a speaker, good talks, good business, get more talks, more business. So as long as you're good, there's a referral thing that's naturally happening, which I'm thankfully not terrible, and it continues to happen. So there's that. The second is back to my network is my net worth. I am always trying, at least from past clients, to provide value or additional value. So whether I worked with them at TELUS or whether I work with them currently in the last 5 years or so, I will check back in with them, not to say, hey, do you want to hire me? But hey, I've got a book for you. Can I send it to you? Hey, I just wrote this article on Forbes. It might be of interest. Hey, I just interviewed Alan Mulally or Ariana Huffington. I thought you might like this thing that I did. Whatever the freebies are that seem to be value add can play out. And an example is being just last week, I get an email from a person that I had done work with 5 years ago and said, hey, you remember when we did X? I think we're ready for Y. I know it's taken a while, but thanks for keeping me in the loop, but here's what we're doing. And then number 3, I actually use a lead gen company called Leadosaurus. And Leadosaurus will go out and hunt effectively for me, like things that make sense for my pie graph. And Leadosaurus has been kind of a wonderful partnership, and the guys there are just fantastic.
Tremendous. Very, very exciting. Well, I've got 2 final closing questions for you. The final question is, how can people get connected and stay connected to you and your amazing work? Before we get to that, if folks were to take one overarching concept from our conversation today about leadership, about work-life bloom, about really plugging in to meaningful life, meaningful work, what would you hope that overarching concept would be?
Well, I put the work-life bloom model, so that 2x2 matrix, right, with the work and the life and the blooming and the 4 personas, I put it against me. I ran it through me. I mean, I've been privileged to work for 2 years as a teacher, 6 years in academia after that, 6 years at SAP, 10 years at TELUS, and now 5 years in my own company of one called Pontefract Group. And David, it was enlightening, and it said a lot because I realized that I have been in all 4 of those personas multiple times at various stages. Not once did a particular logo where I thought, oh my gosh, I was just in blooming the entire time. It's impossible. So I think both leaders and us as human beings looking in the mirror, we need to recognize that there will always be seasonality. There are 4 seasons. And that wherever you work and whatever your role, there is this combination of work and life, and things affect us as human beings. So leaders need to appreciate that, but don't be frustrated that you're not blooming all the time. Let's get that out of the way. You will not bloom all the time. There will be times, whether it's the seasons or, as I say, new company, new acquisition, new thing going on, where you don't feel that there's well-being in your life anymore, whatever it is, you're going to fall. And so your question as an individual is, well, do I need to do anything more in work and life to make that back up to blooming? And if you're a leader, what can you do to have those open conversations to help people potentially back to blooming? That's the key aha moment. And it kind of started with me, David, self-reflecting and looking at those logos and asking myself, geez, I have not bloomed in all of these, and why? So there you go.
Very impactful. Well, Dan Pontefract, tell people where they can get connected and stay connected to you. I know we have some resources, some links. What can people get as far as continuing the conversation with you?
My last name is a bit of a mouthful, Dan Pontefract. So it's probably easier just to go to worklifebloom.com, and that all goes to the same spot. But worklifebloom.com, a little bit about the book, obviously, some freebies that are there, as well as a free assessment. You can find out if you're blooming, budding, stunted, or in renewal. And then another way to get there is worklifebloom.com/assessment.
Fantastic. Well, Dan, amazing value bombs throughout. Thank you so much for stopping by and sharing your wisdom with us.
I love that term, value bombs. And thank you, David. I love what you do. Thanks for all the different types of questions as well, asking you not just about Work-Life Bloom, but about me and my career trajectory. I really appreciate that.
And that wraps up another episode of The Selling Show. Hey, tell you what, if you like us, rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe, tell a friend, go grab the notes and downloads and extras at thesellingshow.com. See you next time.